Hello and welcome to our continuing study on the Sermon on the Mount. Today we're continuing the section where we're looking at the intent of the law versus the letter of the law. And this week I'm going to warn you ahead of time, I might be getting a little personal with some of you because today's topic deals with an issue that many have possibly gone through, and that's the issue of divorce and or adultery. We're going to compare what the Old Testament law said with how Jesus says what the law intends. That is, what God judges to actually be right and wrong compared to just obeying the letter of the law. So let's get right into this. We're looking at Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 32. And we'll start with verses 27 and 28. Jesus is speaking. He says, "You have heard that it was said, 'Do not commit adultery.' But I tell you, everyone who looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." So, Jesus is quoting one of the 10 Commandments, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." And remember, the Pharisees at this time were the political group that believed they were the experts on the law, and they knew exactly what the law said, and they told the other people how the law was to be obeyed and what you were allowed to do and what you were not allowed to do. And Jesus, in this part of the Sermon on the Mount, is simply taking some of these laws, some of these commandments, and comparing what the law actually says with what God meant when he gave the law. Where does the sin actually begin? Because if we just take what this law says, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," and we look at it the way the Pharisees did, as far as the Pharisees were concerned, that meant that a man could basically do whatever he wanted with another woman who was not his wife, so long as he did not actually have sexual intercourse with her. That is, he could stare at her all he wanted to, he could lust after her all he wanted to, and that would not be committing adultery, because the adultery is the actual act. Jesus is telling us, in contrast, though, that that's not what the law means. He says in verse 28, "But I tell you, everyone who looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Again, Jesus tells us it's not the action that is sinful, it is the intention that leads to the action. In other words, you've already committed the sin when you've seriously thought about committing the sin, when you've made up your mind to commit the sin. That's when you've actually already committed the sin. So it's not the actual sexual act that is the sin here. It's the thoughts that you have leading up to the sexual act, the thoughts that, if unchecked, would eventually lead to the act that is the sin. Now, just to be sure we translate this correctly, he says, "Everyone who looks at a woman to lust for her." Now, I am a man. I have grown up as a teenage boy, and I'm an adult man now, and I can tell you from experience that I have looked at women who were not my wife and have lusted. And if you are a man, I can guarantee you have done so as well. If you are a woman, I can almost guarantee that you have looked at a man who was not your husband in the same way. So, is that necessarily sinful? Is me looking at an attractive woman sinful? Is the actual act of me seeing an attractive woman and having a thought pass through my mind, a dirty thought pass through my mind, is that actually sinful? To translate this Greek verb correctly, this verb that's just translated "looks at," this is more of a present participle type verb in the original Greek that means something to the effect of keeps on looking, or to the effect of looks at and then continues to think about. This is not just a passing glance and a quick thought that pops in and pops out of your head. That is, the sin occurs when the man looks at the woman and then either continues to stare at her with thoughts in his head, or even after he stopped looking at her, if he continues to fantasize about being with her, or anything to that effect. For me to fantasize about sexual relations with any woman other than my wife is sinful. Now, we must realize sex in and of itself is not a sin. It is necessary for procreation. It is also something that God has given us that I believe is very pleasurable as long as it is done within the realm that God intended it to be performed, and that is between a man and a woman who are husband and wife and have pledged to be married, or who are actually married to each other, have given their pledge to be faithful to each other for the rest of their lives. And we'll get into that just a little bit later here when we talk about divorce. So, once I married my wife, I made the vow forsaking all others. That means it is a sin for me to even think about being with another woman. But that doesn't mean the occasional thought is not going to pop into my head. But the thought in and of itself is not sinful. It's when I continue to dwell on the thought that it becomes sinful. It's when I continue to think about it, especially if I begin to seriously consider it. That is where the sin comes in. And we need to get that straight. It's not just the passing thought that is sinful. So, Jesus says, anyone who looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery in his heart. So, you've already committed the sin once you've begun that fantasizing process. So, what should we do about it? Let's take a look at verses 29 and 30. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. For it's better that you lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it's better that you lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Now, Jesus is not condoning self-mutilation. Let's get that straight here. Jesus is not saying, if I sin with my hand, cut my hand off. Jesus is using a form of gross exaggeration. He's using a hyperbole, a figure of speech here that we grant to other writers. We need to also grant it to Jesus. He can use these figures of speech just like other people do, and we know what he means. What he simply means is you do whatever it takes to keep you from committing that sin. If you have a problem with a particular type of sin, then don't put yourself in situations where you can commit that sin. If you tend to have lustful thoughts about women, then don't put yourself in situations where you're going to be seeing a lot of attractive women. Or if you can't help it, find a way to avoid having to look at them or having to have contact with them. Find something else to distract you. Memorizing these verses is a good place to start and putting these on your mind. But don't look at those magazines if that's what leads you to think about those women. Don't watch those movies. Don't watch those TV shows, whatever it is. He's using the gross exaggeration. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. In other words, don't look at it if looking at it makes you want to do it. If you have a shoplifting habit, then don't go to stores by yourself. Have someone go with you who can keep an eye on you and keep you from doing that. If you have any type of sinful habit, and that's really good advice for anything, have an accountability partner. Don't be by yourself in situations where things can happen, where you can fall into your pattern of sin. Do whatever you have to do. And if that means changing parts of your life, then do it. Because he says it's better for you to lose part of your body or a part of your lifestyle than for your whole body to go into hell. Now, that doesn't mean that if you've been saved, you're going to go into hell because you keep sinning. We know that if you've been truly saved, you're going to go to heaven. That's the way it is. But if you're truly saved, you should want to live a sinless lifestyle, or at least as close as you can. We know no one's actually going to live a sinless lifestyle, but you're going to realize that what you're doing is wrong, and you're going to try your best to avoid that sin. So Jesus is simply saying, do what it takes. And if it takes some extreme measures on your part, then do those extreme measures. Now, I'm not telling any of you to cut off parts of your body. But if it means radically changing a part of your life, do so. If you're a recovering alcoholic, don't go places where they serve alcohol. If you're a former drug addict, don't hang around people who use drugs. Your true friends are people who don't want to see you fall into your sinful habits. So, associate with Christian people. Get accountability partners. Find people who will help you to live a clean lifestyle. Now, on to another serious issue, but kind of related to the first one here. Let's look at verses 31 and 32. Jesus is still speaking. It was also said, "Whoever divorces his wife must give her a written notice of divorce. But I tell you, everyone who divorces his wife, except in a case of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Now, I know this is going to strike home for a lot of you. Divorce is one of the biggest problems we have in this country today. It seems today that many people go into marriage with the attitude that, well, if it doesn't work, we'll just get divorced. And divorce rates seem to be higher than ever, even among Christian couples. First of all, we need to realize that marriage is not just a legal institution. Marriage is a vow that you make to God. And if you look at it that way, hopefully that makes it a little more serious if you're thinking about getting married or if you already are married. When my wife and I got married some 20 years ago, we stood in a church with one of our best friends who was the preacher, and with our families and with our friends. And I can at least say for my part that I made a vow. I said in front of all those people and in front of God that I promised to keep myself only unto her for as long as we both shall live. Now, what does that mean? That means I promised that I was going to stay with my wife for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and health. We were going to stay together as a couple until one of us dies. And I was serious when I said it, and I'm hoping that she was serious when she said it to me. And I believe I know her well enough to know that she was. And so far for 20 years, it's worked. Now, that is not to say that we don't have disagreements. Everybody has disagreements. People are not perfect. You are not going to agree with your spouse on every little thing. But, and I'm just speaking from personal experience here, in the 6 years that we dated before we got married, and yes, I said 6 years. I know to some people that seems a long time. One of the things we discussed before we got married was that once we got married, if we ever had a disagreement, divorce was not going to be an option. And we were clear with each other on that before we ever went to the altar. Because we had both done Bible studies together, we knew what Jesus said here. And if Jesus said it, then he meant it. Marriage was always meant to be one man, one woman together for life. And the only thing that would break that marriage is if one of the partners dies. Now, once one of the partners dies, the other one is free to date again, to marry again, whatever that person feels like doing. Unfortunately, again, today there are people who just say, well, I just don't love that person anymore. Or, that's not the person that I married. Well, the first thing I would ask is, and to be honest, I'm not a marriage counselor. I'm just a person who's been married for 20 years. First thing I would ask is, well, how long did you know each other before you were married? A marriage counseling class that I went to before we got married, the counselor said, never marry someone until you've dated them for at least a year, because people change with the seasons. And the person that you know in the summer may have a completely different mood swing in the winter. So date them for at least a year so you can get to know what they're like year-round. And I think that's good advice. I would simply say, don't marry that person unless you know that God is telling you to marry that person, and unless you are willing to make that promise and mean that promise when you say it, that you will keep yourself only unto that person for as long as you both shall live. Now, when God gave the law to the Jewish people, when God gave the law of Moses, Jesus says in another passage, it was because of their hard hearts that God put this provision in there, where he said, whoever divorces his wife must give her a written notice of divorce. He's mentioning a passage in Deuteronomy 24 where it simply says that if a man finds something indecent about his wife, he can simply give her a written notice of divorce, and from then on, they are legally divorced. And basically all that was a piece of paper that said she was free to marry again whoever she wanted. The Pharisees and the other religious groups had a field day with that word indecent. What do you mean find something indecent about her? Most likely Moses meant, or God meant through Moses, what Jesus is saying here. In fact, I'm sure that this is what God actually meant, except in a case of sexual immorality, Jesus says in verse 32. And I'm sure that's what God meant by finding something indecent about her, if she's been unfaithful to him. But the Pharisees simply took that to mean if she burnt the toast that morning, that's legal grounds for divorce. If she says or does anything that you don't like, that was legal grounds for divorce. And all you had to do was write her a note saying, I divorce you, sign it, give it to her, and you're free from any obligation. But Jesus is saying that's not the way it was meant to be. Jesus says that the only grounds for divorce that God condones is sexual immorality. If one of the partners is committing adultery with someone else, then God will allow or God will condone a divorce in that case because one of them has broken the vow. And when the vow is broken, the vow becomes invalid. Now, I would say that it should be the one who broke the vow who initiates the divorce. If my wife is unfaithful to me, I should make every effort I can to save my marriage and not divorce unless she initiates the divorce. Now that's me, not God. The Apostle Paul also gives another ground for divorce. He says that if a Christian is married to a non-Christian. Now, the case he's specifically referring to is if you have two non-Christians who are married and then one of them becomes a Christian, that person, of course, is going to have a changed lifestyle. He's saying if the spouse of that Christian then wants to leave the marriage, then the Christian should let the non-Christian go. The Christian should not, again, be the one to initiate the divorce. Now, if you are already a Christian, you should not be marrying someone who is not a Christian. The only mixed marriage that there is if a Christian marries a non-Christian. God does not say you can't do that, but he strongly advises against it because it's more likely that the non-Christian is going to bring the Christian down rather than the Christian bringing the non-Christian up. However, Paul does say that it should not be the Christian to initiate the divorce because he said, who knows? Through your life, you may be able to save your spouse. Your spouse may see the change in you and want to become saved, him or herself. So the Christian should not be the one to initiate the divorce. So what if you're already divorced? And I know some of you watching this may be. Some of you may have been divorced multiple times. The good news is God does offer forgiveness. If you've been divorced and it hasn't been on one of these grounds, God forgives. You're not going to go to hell just because you've been divorced. God wants Christians to live in a certain way because he wants us to be different from the rest of the world. He wants people to be able to look at us and say, I like the way that person lives. I want to be like that myself. What is it that makes you different? And then that gives us an opportunity to present the gospel. If we are living the same way the rest of the world is living, then why should the world want to be saved? So, just as in the case of any other sin, God forgives. And if you've been through a divorce that wasn't one of these cases, God can forgive you. Just ask. If you're not saved, then first of all, these don't apply to you anyway. If you're not saved, I recommend that you read an article on my website, brianvermeer.com, called Know Jesus. Look on the right side of the webpage. There'll be a link to it. And that will tell you how you can come to know the gift of salvation that Christ offers. And that's the most important decision that you'll ever make in your life. Marriage, possibly a close second. But salvation, certainly the most important decision you'll ever make. Because that determines where you will spend eternity. I'm married to my wife. We've been married 20 years. I hope we'll be married for another 50 or 60, at least. But when we die, the marriage is over. Heaven or hell will be forever. I love my wife, but I also love God. if it came down to the two, God would have to come first. I know that, and she knows that. So if you're not a Christian, please at least read the article. Find out how much God loves you and that God wants to bring you to Him. Then you can work on your spouse. Then you can look for a Christian man or woman to marry. Maybe God hasn't called you to get married. There are some that the Apostle Paul says that God calls to be single. The Apostle Paul himself was never married. Or if he was widowed, because he does mention specifically a couple of times that he was single and he had no desire to get married because he felt that would interfere with his spreading the gospel. Because a married man does have a lot to look after. But just remember, if you're thinking about getting married, please don't let your wedding vows just be something you say out of tradition or just because you think that's what you're supposed to say. Remember, those wedding vows are sacred. It's a promise you're making not only to your spouse, but also to God, to be with that person for the rest of your life. If you love that person, you'll want to be with that person for the rest of your life. And if you love that person, then no matter what kind of problem you have, you will want to work it out. Let me close just by saying this. I heard a preacher once who was saying that a man came to him and said that he wanted to get a divorce because he just didn't love his wife anymore. The preacher told him, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go home and love your wife. And the man said, you don't understand. I don't love my wife anymore. And the preacher said, yes, I understand. And that's why I'm telling you to go home and love your wife. I try to love my wife every day. I try to show my wife that I love her every day. We still argue sometimes. We don't see eye to eye on everything. But we love each other. And because we love each other, we are going to try to work out any difficulty that we have. And with God's help, I believe that we can. And I believe that the next 20 years of our marriage will be just as happy as the past. And the 20 years after that, and for as long as God allows us to live, I believe He will allow us to have a contented, happy marriage. And He can do the same for you. You just have to be sure that you include Him in your marriage. And don't lead yourself, as the first part of the passage says, into any kind of situation that could end up jeopardizing your marriage. When I chose my wife, I forsook all other women. I should not even be thinking about other women. I hope that my wife, and I trust that my wife, is not even thinking about any other men. And the reason I try not to think about other women is because I love my wife, and I don't want to do anything to hurt her. So please, if your marriage is struggling, go to God. Pray to God. Ask what you need to do. Maybe you need to change something about your life. You may need to have a frank discussion with your spouse. Find out what the problem is. If nothing else, go to your pastor. If you don't have one, find a church to attend. Attend church together. Get to know God. Get to know each other better. Because God intends you to be married for life. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them below. If you don't know Jesus, please read that article. Because that's the first thing you need to take care of. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you again next week.